Hi, I'm Ros Cardinal, Managing Director of Shaping Change, and welcome to this webinar on public speaking. Before we get started though, I'd like you to ponder a few things. Think about the most effective presentation or speech you've ever heard. What was it that made it work so well? How did the speaker capture and hold the attention of the audience? And why did you form such a positive impression of the speaker? I'd like you to pause the video and take a moment to make a few notes. All right, welcome back. I'd like you to hold those thoughts and consider them as we go through this presentation. But here's some stats. According to a survey by the Sunday Times of London, 41% of people list public speaking as their biggest fear. Even bigger than small spaces, darkness, spiders, even death. Standing up in front of a crowd and talking is far more terrifying for most people. However, if you can get over this fear, getting comfortable speaking in public can be a great boost, and not to mention a huge benefit to your career. What we're going to cover in this webinar will give you some valuable public speaking skills, including in-depth information on developing an engaging program or speech and delivering your presentation with power. At the end of this webinar, you should be able to identify your audience, create a basic outline, organise your ideas, flesh out your presentation, find the right words, prepare all the details, overcome nervousness, deliver a polished and professional speech, and handle questions and comments effectively. The key to effective public speaking really is preparation. The better you prepare, the more confident you're going to feel. Preparation really begins with identifying your audience. What do you know about your audience? What do they care about? What's important to them? Have they got any misconceptions about your topic? These are the kinds of questions you should ask as part of your preparation. Sitting down and listing the questions and your answers to them will give you the basic structure for your speech, around which you can add things and take them away as you see fit. Holding the attention of an audience and speaking to what interests them is the most important thing about any public speech. It's not only about what you say, but also how you say it. If you've got a message you want to get across, then think of how that message will communicate itself best to the audience that you're speaking to. Okay, let's start by creating your audience profile. These are the things you need to consider. Firstly, education. If your audience is well educated, you can use reasonably sophisticated language. And if they're not, you need to keep things simple. How familiar they are with your topic. What do people know about your topic already, and what are you going to need to explain? You need to think about jargon. Avoid any specialised vocabulary unless you think everyone in the audience is going to understand it. If you've got to use a technical term, then explain it. Also think about the use of acronyms. Acronyms can be very specific to industry, and people outside those industries might not have any idea what you're talking about. Think about interest in the topic. What do people care about? What's important to them? What misconceptions do they have? What incorrect ideas might you need to correct? And attitude. Are your audience going to be hostile, supportive, curious, worried? The attitude of your audience will absolutely affect the tone of your speech. One of the most important elements of written or spoken language is the register it's delivered in. Experts say there are 3 registers of language, which they call R1, R2 and R3. R1 is the level of language used most commonly by, say, politicians, lawyers, and it's found in the upper market range of newspapers. R2 is the most commonly used by people in everyday conversation with acquaintances and people maybe they've just met. And R3 is the register that may be used between close friends, and it's heavily based in slang. Consider how educated your audience is and how formal you want your speech to be, and that will really govern the choice of register. Your audience's familiarity and interest in your topic is also going to be really important. You might be, say, seeking to educate your audience on the topic or to communicate your own ideas to an audience who are already really familiar with it. Deciding between these will help to shape your speech. If people are familiar with your topic, it doesn't hurt to include some jargon, as it can make your speech a little bit more dynamic. And if you don't need to keep explaining things, you can communicate your ideas more effectively. The mood and opinion of your audience is also important. It'll influence the tone and the content of your speech, as a nervous or worried audience will require an element of comfort or reassurance, whereas an audience that's feeling fairly maybe positive and in a celebratory mood will want to share a positive electric atmosphere and possibly hear some congratulations. Now, one person speaking to a large crowd is in a unique position. They've got the attention of many people and the power to get across ideas that will change mindsets and behaviour on maybe a large scale. It's really important to consider how you phrase things and that you correct any persistent misconceptions of which you're aware. If you've got a good understanding of your audience, you can probably predict the key questions and concerns that they're likely to have. You might not be able to give them the answers they'd like to hear, but at least you should be ready to discuss the things they care most about. Many speeches these days are followed by a question and answer session, which allows the audience to raise any issues they maybe feel haven't been fully dealt with by the original speech. But it's far better for the audience if the original speech deals with these concerns. It shows that you've thought them through rather than addressing them kind of on the go. Predicting questions and concerns should be relatively straightforward. If you're in a position to address a larger group of people, the chances are that you've got knowledge of the issues that affect them and how these can be addressed. It's also possible to maybe take a sounding from people on the ground as to what's concerning them. And it may be that you share those concerns and explain to people that you've given thought to addressing them. If you can speak intelligently and with feeling about issues that concern your audience, they're going to have a lot more trust that you can help to provide solutions to the problems and that their position is actually understood and respected. It can help before delivering your speech or presentation to make a list of the 5 most searching questions you would expect people to have. Your presentation should then really concern itself with addressing those questions as well as delivering your own viewpoints. When delivering your speech, it's really helpful to pay tribute to the fact these concerns exist by saying something along the lines of, "Before I go any further, I'd like to raise an issue that I know has been foremost amongst the minds of people here." And as the audience is giving you their attention, it's simply reasonable to make it really clear that they too have yours. Okay, now we've thought about our audience, it's time to turn our attention to creating your basic outline. The main advantage of creating an outline is that it helps you to organise your thoughts. The audience gets more out of a presentation when it's well organised. They're also more likely to think that the speaker knows the subject thoroughly and has given some thought on how to present it. In this module, we'll be considering a hypothetical presentation about a project that's just been completed, but the general approach we'll consider is applicable to just about any type of presentation. Often this approach is seen as being maybe similar to creating a body. You start with the skeleton, which is your basic outline, the bare minimum of the speech, in something like the shape it will eventually take, and progress by adding meat to the bones and layering the rest on top of that. At key points of the presentation, specific issues will need to be confronted, and by allotting them a place in the basic outline, you'll be able to ensure that these are prioritised and addressed accordingly. Now, almost every project addresses a problem or an opportunity or both. An effective way to introduce your speech is by outlining the situation your project addresses. This approach really forces you to get to the point straight away. In outlining the situation, try to avoid giving too much history or background. Most people don't care about that sort of information. If you start out discussing something people don't care about, it's going to be really hard to recapture their interest. Provide only the background information people will need to understand the situation. Your audience in many cases may already know the background, and covering old ground will simply lead to a "here we go again" feeling in the room. So instead of starting with a history of the problem, the nature of the problem can be covered in a few sentences and followed with a statement of what you as a group decided had to be done about it. It's beneficial to make reference to situations and occasions where the audience is familiar. In doing this, you're going to keep their attention by recognising their opinions mattered and were taken into account. The introduction of your presentation is where you'll often take and hold an audience's attention or lose it for good. It's really wise then to keep your introduction brief and informative, and it really just sets the scene for the rest of the presentation. What you want to do here is really connect the audience. You're looking for a "what's in it for me" because that's what makes people pay attention to it. So in an introduction, there are a few essential elements to keep in mind. First of all, you need to introduce yourself and your capacity with regards to the project, or perhaps with regards to your expertise to the topic at hand. Even if everyone there already knows you, it helps to explain exactly why you're the one delivering the presentation. And then give a brief overview of what the presentation is going to address. And that stops people in the audience from thinking, when are they going to get to the bit about X? And it allows everybody to concentrate on basically the content of the presentation itself. All right, now in our hypothetical presentation about a project, the next piece is to identify the task that had to be performed. Your task description is your organising principle for the rest of the presentation, and most of what follows is going to be an account of really what you did to complete the task. One way to come up with a simple and clear task description is just imagine you're writing for a teenager. How would you describe what you did to somebody who knows very little about your work? Now, obviously, you can tweak this depending on your audience, but it's worthwhile remembering that the audience will maybe all have their specialties in certain fields, and something that's really obvious to you may not be evident to people in your audience. Now, this doesn't mean that a lot of your speech should be taken up by lengthy explanations of what you do. Think of it in a similar way to a film. In most films, we have periods of what directors call exposition, which is where they're laying down the backstory, which is really telling us why what we're watching had to happen. Now, interestingly, film reviewers are really quick to criticise films which have lots of spells of exposition, as all we really need are essential details. We can pretty much piece the rest together for ourselves. So take the same approach to explaining the task you were dealing with. Give the important details and assume a basic level of understanding. Now, the result of having these brief explanations is that your wider presentation will be set into a certain context, and in this context, the things you say will make sense. When you've completed your first draft of your presentation or your speech, it helps to read over it and see if it would make sense to someone who's coming to the presentation without the information you have. Any terms that might give confusion can be explained a little bit better so that the audience can follow you. And if there's any confusion after that, a quick question and answer period can generally pick that up. The next step is to then list the actions that you took. If a presentation's got a list of actions, it's a really good idea to present the list either on a slide or a flip chart. People have a hard time keeping more than 3 or 4 items straight in their head unless they actually see them displayed. And as you go through your list in your presentation, you can point to each item on the chart or highlight it on the slide. It'll make it easier for people to follow along, and it also helps people see where you are in your presentation and how much longer you're likely to talk for. It's important to do this for several reasons. Firstly, if people are confused as to what exactly is going to be dealt with and when, they're liable to lose concentration. And any key points you make in the presentation will resonate less because people are just thinking and wondering about what's coming next. Secondly, there will be people in the audience who, although they're keen to listen closely to the presentation, are maybe still wondering when their particular area of interest will be dealt with. And we change how we listen depending on our familiarity with the topic. And thirdly, if people are concerned about the length of the presentation, their minds will wander as it passes the point where they would have hoped for it to finish. So making your audience aware of the structure of your presentation in advance may seem to some like an invitation for them to tune in and tune out as the topics suit them, but having a table of contents actually allows people to keep concentrating. In the areas where they're less informed than in others, they'll tend to listen closely in order to inform themselves. And in the areas of expertise, they'll listen not more closely but differently, giving themselves a chance to contribute after the presentation if necessary. So a good structure doesn't only help the writer and deliverer of a presentation, but the audience as well. It's much easier to maintain concentration if you're aware of what you should be concentrating on, and this means that you'll carry the audience with you over the course of your presentation, allowing them to be better informed, reassured and prepared at the end of your presentation than they were at the beginning. Revealing the results of your project really involves answering a few basic questions. Did the project achieve its goal? Were there any unexpected consequences? And what's next? The first question might seem it's really obvious and it's got an obvious answer. Simply put, either it achieved its objective or it didn't. However, any project is going to have stages of success and stages of failure. And deciding whether your project achieved its goals, it's important to refer back to the questions and brief that you set out in the introduction to your presentation. There was a plan to achieve something. Did it succeed? If so, did it come through on or ahead of schedule? Was any outside help needed? If it failed, did it fall some distance short or close enough to be termed a deferment rather than a straight failure? As for your unexpected consequences, these happen in any project. In preparation for your project, it's common to look ahead at potential problems and think about how these can be avoided or addressed. But look, the best laid plans can always run up against unforeseen problems. And actually, for that matter, unforeseen benefits as well. These can change the shape of your project and they can lead to the redrawing of your entire brief. Often the kind of on-the-spot management that's really required to handle these situations can be the difference between success and failure. And any conclusion should really deal with these circumstances, how they arose and how they were dealt with. At the end of your presentation, it's fairly safe to say the audience will be much better informed as to the extent of the success or the failure of your plan. And then obviously people's minds start to turn naturally to the matter of where things are going next. Assuming the business hasn't been wound up, there'll be follow-up work to do and getting on with that work is going to be the priority. The question of what's next can be answered with reference to the presentation you've just delivered, because everyone's going to be clearer now on the consequences of what's happened, and now's really the best time to lay down the plan for going forward.